But all the time, there was this thing about the environment. And then I learned about climate change sometime in the 90s. And I thought, oh, this is a big deal. And then in 1999, my first son was born. A little voice inside me says, do something. I had no idea what to do. 2001, my second son is born. The little voice gets louder, do something. Still had no idea what to do. Then all of a sudden in 2007, I was working here in town at Efficiency New Brunswick at the time, just when it was started up. And one day I came into work and my colleagues were talking about this new book that was called An Inconvenient Truth, written by former US Vice President Al Gore about climate change. And I thought, Al Gore, what does he know about climate change? Well, it turns out quite a bit. I got the book and I remember reading it that summer and telling my wife, I said, Karen, I think this book is going to change the world. Because it's written, two reasons. One, it's written by a famous person. And two, it takes this complicated issue of climate change and brings it down to a level where everybody can understand it. And it seems to me we need to know, and then when we know, we can act. Then I found out Al Gore would be training people to present live versions of that slideshow, and I thought, that's for me. So I applied, persisted, pestered, and found myself down in Nashville training with Al Gore. And the short answer is, not long after that, I left Efficiency New Brunswick and I started doing this kind of stuff full time. I'd like to think that I found my bigger inner voice. So here I am, and I know what you might be thinking after you hear that story. You say, oh, come on, Carl, that's just Baldoon. Except Baldoon might be a nice microcosm for planet Earth, a smaller version of it. So, as I said, we have not a lot of time together here, an hour and 15 minutes, and I know lunchtime is at noon, so I pledge to keep an eye on that clock back there. But over the next hour and 15 minutes, here are my goals. I'd like to start with an update on climate change, and that picture is deliberate. It's what keeps me awake at night. I live in that space, and it seems to me it's an insufficiently understood issue these days, even in our modern world with so much information. So, and it seems to me it underlies everything we do, right? We're not going to run out of fossil fuels. The whole reason for an energy transition is not because we're running out of fossil fuels. It's climate change. So I'd like to start with sharing with you highlights of the things that keep me awake at night, living in that space. Then onto energy literacy and how that can be a big part of the solution going forward. Part of that, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it piece. And then finally get into community-based social marketing as a tool that potentially can help change behaviors as well. And this is a smaller group. I've set aside, kind of, depending on how long I talk here, time for questions at the end. But you know, if there's something that's compelling and pressing, just put up your hand and we'll see. We can take a pause. All right? So let's get started then with the things that keep me awake at night, and that would be the climate change piece. And this will probably take 25, 30 minutes, something like that, the first portion. And this is at the heart of it, right here. You know that, right? Remember that from math class? Exponential growth curve. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Sometimes people don't understand it, and I say it's what happens to your credit card balance if you don't pay it off. Exponential growth, that's growth that's increasing at an increasing rate. And it represents so many of human impacts on the planet. I mean, it's population, it's our consumption of water, it's our consumption of just about every resource out there on this finite planet. But for the purpose of climate change, this is the one I'd like to focus on. It's our consumption of oil, coal, and natural gas, the fossil fuels that we all know. Started at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It was minuscule and negligible before then, but it really ramped up after the steam engine was invented. And, well, it worked so well because they did work for us. Life got better. And it's to the point where today we're using more and more and more fossil fuels, and we're the luckiest generation ever. We've got life better than anybody ever before us. But it's come with a bit of a consequence, right? Because when we burn oil, coal, natural gas, we generate emissions. The main one, carbon dioxide, not a poison. It's absorbed by plants. The only thing is we put more and more and more up there, and essentially the greenery of the world isn't sufficient to haul it all back, and the level in our atmosphere is building up. But we're so dependent in our world on fossil fuels for everything, you know, that we're having a hard time breaking our addiction, even though we know probably it's not a good thing. It's tough. right? Because fossil fuels are so easy. Remember the Beverly Hillbillies? Oil came bubbling out of the ground, right? And I read a book recently about the Industrial Revolution. Why did it happen in England? Because coal was at the surface of the ground in England, more so than it was anywhere else. Fossil fuels brought us to where we are. We owe them a lot. The only thing is now we've come to see, maybe we need to change. One little thing to hopefully drive home the impact of exponential growth. Because I think most of us get it intuitively, but maybe we can't quite get it in terms of how startling and stark it is. And that is this, the significance of 1994. If you take all of the fossil fuels that have been consumed since the start of the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to today, all of the oil, coal, natural gas, half of it's been consumed since 1994, the last 30 years. That's not just in my lifetime, that's in my post-university professional lifetime. I was in my second job already in 1994. You say that again, half of all the fossil fuels ever consumed since the start of the Industrial Revolution been consumed in the last 30 years. If you put that timeline on a 1 hour timeline, it means half of everything consumed in that hour has been consumed in the last 6 minutes. That's exponential growth. See, and if ever you've wondered why we have life so good, we do. It's because of that. We've been consuming fossil fuels, AKA energy, like never before. Now that's just a schematic, right? You say, well, that's just an exponential growth curve. Except look at that, how it lays over actual emissions. Almost a perfect exponential growth curve. And if we look at New Brunswick's emissions, this is where it may start to bite a little bit for some of us in this room. Please don't take it personally here, but you see the slices where we are, and you see the big three. This one is primarily 300,000 plus tailpipes that go down our roads every day, right? Personal vehicles, mostly cars, trucks, SUVs. The other two, well, a quick pop quiz for you here, because this is a smaller room. I have a feeling you know the answer here to this one. What's New Brunswick's single largest source of emissions? Single source. I'm sorry? Refinery, yeah. Anyone any guesses on the second? I kind of figured this audience would get it. Yeah, there we are, number 1 and number 2. Beldoon, our last coal-fired plant in the province, a ton every 18 seconds. So it's probably up to about a ton by now since that slide has been up too. So then the easy solution is to blame Irving and NV Power, right? Except it's not that easy. How did we get here this morning, all of us? Pretty much all of us. Relying on fossil fuels. What's keeping the lights on? Well, Beldoon coal plant is contributing to the mix that's keeping the lights on right now. So technically, all of us own a share of those. And that's not just us here, that's every New Brunswicker. So it's a bit of a hard reality, but it's unavoidable too, isn't it? It's an unavoidable reality. So, well, then here's another exponential growth curve. That's the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And let's put a few numbers to this one as well. Back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were way down here, 277 parts per million. And, you know, over the billions of years of the planet, that's fluctuated. But in terms of human existence on the planet, for the most part, it's been stable somewhere around that area. Around that area, not precisely, but around that area. So at the start of the Industrial Revolution, 277 parts per million. Fast forward to 1962, a critical year. At least for me, because it's the year I was born. But you see already then we're up to 320 parts per million, so we've come up 43 parts per million. Fast forward to today, earlier this week, we were at 421 parts per million, literally off the chart on this one. And once again, that's exponential growth. Because I don't have the slide in this presentation, but I put the real level on a graph, and it's a perfect exponential growth curve yet again. And for this one, if you look, you do the math, 70% of the increase since then has happened in my lifetime again. And again, I don't feel very old. 70%. Whew. Don't know about you, but that blows me away. Well, if all of this is true, then we should be seeing consequences, right? Here's a slide that I update every year in January. Had to update it again this year because, in fact, this time, 2023 was the hottest year since we've been measuring records. January 2024 is the hottest January since we've been measuring records. Even in New Brunswick, we see differences. You know, every now and then you hear, oh, we set a weather record yesterday. And weather records happen because weather's a chaotic system, right? The only thing is, in a stable climate, it's logical to expect that we'd get the same number of new record highs and new record lows, right? Here's what happened across the Maritimes last year, or across Atlantic Canada. About a 5-to-1 ratio. The slide that I had for the year previous, it was about 10-to-1 ratio. This is my nominee for the official mascot of climate change, the octopus. Reason? Tentacles. Climate change has so many tentacles that reach into so many areas of our lives, many surprising areas of our lives too. And yet most of us probably don't really understand that. Don't have time to get into all of them today. That takes a while. Again, I get the sense we don't appreciate it as much as perhaps we ought to. I know for me, when I first started working on climate change, this was the big blow your mind aha moment, sea level rise. Had no idea. But you see, I was chatting with someone not too long ago and they said, yeah, it's because the Arctic sea ice is melting. No, the Arctic sea ice is melting, but it's way up here. It's floating ice, like an ice cube in a glass. It's already displaced its weight in the water, so it just melts. It's not a good thing, but it doesn't change the level of the glass in the water, aka the world's ocean. But instead, when you have land-based ice like this, on Greenland, that's a different story because it's sitting up out of the water. The size of the Greenland ice sheet, it's the size of Quebec, all of Quebec. The depth of ice at its thickest point, so it's actually 3 kilometers, 6 times the height of the CN Tower at its deepest point in the middle. It's so thick, it's pressed the land down below sea level underneath it. There's so much weight sitting there on it. There's a lot of water locked up in Greenland. And, well, see there, it's extensive. That's not fog, that's not cloud, that's ice. It extends over all of Greenland, pretty much. So here's a quiz for you. 5 options here. If all the ice in Greenland were to melt, sea levels worldwide would rise by how much? Now, I will hasten to add, because I could be accused of a little bit of sensationalism in this one, because that's not going to happen overnight. Even in a worst case scenario, that's a hundreds of years process. The only thing is, climate change to me is like a train. I think more than just to me, but it's essentially takes an awful lot to get a train moving, but once she's rolling, it takes a lot to slow her down. Right? Climate change is a bit like that. If all of the ice in Greenland melted, we'd be 5 meters of sea level rise worldwide. And there's about 10 times that amount of water, 10 times, locked up in Antarctica too. If you're blown away, well, join the crowd. I couldn't believe that when I first heard about it. And that's not even counting the glaciers that are up in mountains. There's another bit of sea level rise locked up there too, but the big ones, Greenland and Antarctica, they're the big ones. So increasingly we're seeing changes happening in Greenland in the last few years. I can't keep up with the headlines anymore because it seems there are new technologies, LiDAR and everything else, measuring losses, and the numbers are not going especially in a good direction. And that's a concern if you live in a province that's surrounded on 3 sides by water, right? I get the sense this is an underappreciated reality here in New Brunswick. That's why I put it at the top of my list. Let's bring it a little bit closer to home. And this will be the last slide on this piece. A couple of years ago, there was a study done here in New Brunswick on impacts, projected impacts of storm surges, sea level rise, etc., on our coasts around. And our coasts were divided up into, I think, 14 zones. And the report was issued in 2020. And here is the sheet for this zone, from Point Lepreau basically to Cape Spencer, which I guess is out Mispik area, something like that. And it's a ton of numbers here, right? And I apologize for that already, but let's zero in on the numbers that I think matter. So if you look at, back in 2010, a storm surge 4.7 meters could be expected every 50 to 100 years. Fast forward, that's 14 years ago. Fast forward to 6 years from now, 2030, and that type of thing can be expected every 10 years. It's a pretty big difference, pretty quick. Fast forward again to 2050, and you see that's every 2 years. You know, this morning I spoke to a group at St. Malachy's, and I said to them, you'll be middle-aged by then. I still hope to be around by then, but poof, big difference, right? And if you've probably gone ahead of me, right? So you see 2100. Kids born today will be around then. And, well, time doesn't end at 2100 either. The study just ended there. So it's a pretty big deal, sea level rise, right? Here's the other one that goes with it and that underlies storm surges. That would be intensification of our weather systems. And that's because of straight physics. You know, we have the water cycle where water constantly is in motion, evaporating, condensing, and then coming down as precipitation, water, rain, snow, whatever other form. Constant, all the time. Well, the thing is with warmer oceans, warmer water evaporates faster. It's straight physics. Warmer air holds more water. It's straight physics. That means it can dump bigger amounts of water as well. Here's we've already seen that the air is getting warmer. Here's what's happening to the oceans. They've had a really, I would call it frightening, for me even, uptick in temperatures the last little while, particularly in the last year. The mayor of Sackville was in Ottawa just a couple of months ago in front of a panel saying, look, sea level rise keeps us awake in Sackville, the risk of floods. And the mayor of Amherst said the same thing. We're going to need to build a dike or a higher causeway or something because Nova Scotia is going to become an island here. It's an unfortunate reality. And there's so many other things that have to do with so many other tentacles relating to, well, invasive species. Where are these guys going and why? Warmer waters, change of food supply, acidification of oceans. That's really making it really hard for coral reefs and anything with a shell. And all of a sudden the flowers and the bees are out of sync. Then we've got some big food issues. And, you know, here's another thing. My background is agriculture. Man, do we ever rely on commercial fertilizers, which are nitrogen-based, which comes from natural gas, and food chains from trucks to refrigeration, you name it, deeply embedded with our dependence on fossil fuels too, right? So many other impacts. And of course, by the way, these depend on the right temperature and the right rainfall as well. Food production. All of this interconnectedness reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from 170 years ago from Chief Seattle. He said, man doesn't weave the web of life. He's merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, does to himself, because all things are connected. All things are connected. If you take nothing away from this except that, well, I'll still call it a success here today. All things are connected. If you follow climate at all, then you probably know the target is 1.5 degrees. We're kind of getting pretty close to actually hitting that in recent months. But the target is lower, so then, well, the 565 gigatons, to be honest, I don't know what the latest number is on this, but I would assume time has passed, and with a lower target, both of those factors would lower that number. Right? And number 3, I'm guessing new technologies like fracking would actually increase that number. I'm guessing that the ratio now is higher than it was before. You see how that's a challenge? Because I get that in our world of economics, this is money on a balance sheet. How do we deal with this? It's an enormous problem, and that's the reason why I thought it important to share with a group like this, because it's an unavoidable reality. You know, to simplify it, I just bring it down to just because there's gas at the global gas station doesn't mean we can safely burn it. It's kind of the space we're in. And a lot of people will say, yeah, but what about economics and our economy and all that? Yeah, you're right. We're in for some changes here, I suppose. Except I'd argue that the environment is probably something we need even more than our economy, if we can imagine. So what's needed? Let's get to solutions then. And in its most basic form, perhaps it would be represented by this. This is the carbon cycle. Maybe you remember that from school. Carbon's like water. Carbon is very mobile. We put it up there every time we exhale or when something rots or anything burns. Wood, fossil fuels, you name it. Anything burns, carbon goes up. Comes back down thanks to anything green. So that would be the obvious ones are forests. But also a big one that I learned in the process of my own journey here is phytoplankton, algae in the oceans. About 1/3 of the carbon comes down thanks to phytoplankton, single cell plants in the ocean. So historically, pretty much as long as we've been around, the carbon cycle has been in balance. About the same amount going up, same amount coming down, so it's stable up here. But, you see, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been digging up these guys, which were safely locked up out of the carbon cycle. Not for decades, not for centuries, not for millennia, for millions of years, locked up. But we've been burning them, so we're introducing more carbon here. On this side of the equation, there are some parts of the world where we're impairing the ability of greenery to haul it back down again. You don't need to be a math genius to see what happens there, right? So the simplest way I can bring it down to climate solutions would be to say, we just need to rebalance the carbon cycle. So let's drill a little deeper then into some targets and data and goals here. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the UN's organization of leading scientists from countries all around the world. They kind of function on a least common denominator basis with their reports because everybody's got to agree before they come out with something. And they came out with a report, I think it was last March, their latest report in terms of targets. And, well, here is where we are headed. Slight exponential if we continue with the scenario called business as usual. But if we follow the guidance of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is where we need to go. 43% down, below not where we are now, but where we were in 2019, by 2030. That's suddenly just 6 years from now. That's like 1% every 2 months, just about. And then we need to bring ourselves down to net zero, finish the job sometime in the 2050s. Any way you look at it, that is a steep downward trend that we've got to somehow get into. And if you're like me, you're thinking, maybe we could use some kind of a magical form of energy that we just plug our cables into and get all the power we need without consequence. Unfortunately, as far as we know, there is, you guys would know this too, right? As far as we know, there is no single solution out there. No silver bullet, silver buckshot, because instead of one technology can bring us back down, well, there are a whole bunch of different ones, and if we stack them up together, we can bring ourselves down to where we need to be. But it's still aggressive by any stretch of the imagination. It is, there's no doubt. It's not easy. Most of these slices here start with the same two words: more efficient. Vehicles, public transit, buildings, homes, urban design, more efficient, everything. And there's a big slice that has to do with renewable energy as well. Renewable energy, huge. What's really needed, it seems to me, because we kind of know what we need to do. We kind of know all the existing technology can get us there if we really apply ourselves. But what's really needed, I call it a global epiphany. We need our collective commitment, ourselves and our governments, everybody on board to wake up to climate change and to start moving ourselves in the right direction. So let's move on then towards solutions and where we can go. And I get the sense that you learn a lot in the course, the rest of the other modules that you do under this program, about a whole bunch of different strategies. And in chatting with Michelle, I figured I'd focus on energy literacy and then social marketing. So let's get started with energy literacy. Today, most consumers live in a black hole when it comes to energy. This is an oft-quoted thing, and it goes back like 20 years ago, but I think it's still fairly true, right? Most people really don't know. And why would that be? Why are we in a black hole? We have no information, first of all, for the most part. There's no big thing flashing that says how much power something uses. But why else would we be in a black hole when it comes to energy literacy? I think a short list could include don't care, no interest, too busy with my life, too busy, there we go, too complicated perhaps, because it does get into a bit of physics and math and science, probably, and some people just aren't in that space, right? Or maybe the bottom one would be no incentive, which relates to what you mentioned too. There's no reason for me to have to know about it because, for example, it doesn't make a difference when I switch that light. It doesn't have any impact on how much I pay for that power. So the consequence of that might be that anyone who really wants to become energy literate might get a little frustrated or not feel very empowered. No info. No way to make the decisions, even if I really wanted to. Here's another big consequence, and I think there's some people from NB Power in the room. You know all about this one, the two-peak challenge. And you know, St. John Energy, by extension, I think it has that same one because you buy your power and you pay peak rates at these peak times. But I think everybody knows about these enough, right? When we're making our coffee and taking our showers and making our toast and everything else, we get this big peak in the morning. The peaker plants are always the dirtiest plants, usually the most expensive plants. Sometimes it's hard to find power down the line even, so you got to fire up the old ancient ones that barely run at all. And it's way more expensive for the utility to generate this power, as well as being bad for the environment typically. And here's the bigger issue for all of us. We have to build, NB Power as our utility has to build infrastructure to meet, for the most part, this highest peak. Because when we had this peak last February, a year ago, how much did we get from Quebec that time? Quebec was going through its own little peak, it seems to me, and they let us know, what, the day before, something like that? We won't have anything to send down the wire. And that was kind of what put the kibosh on the Atlantic Loop concept, from what I understand too. Because it's great to have all the wires you want, but there's got to be power to send. So anyways, here we need to have infrastructure in place to meet a peak. And that's really expensive, especially, I remember hearing before about how many days a year Coulson Cove runs. It's an expensive plant to keep well maintained for the few days that it has to run. Right? So bad for the utility, bad for the environment too. But it's a legacy of, well, nobody knows anything about, none of us really know anything about energy to speak of. So what are some shortcomings of a bill like this? And here are the ones that I had thought, well, one, it arrives a month late. I mean, late, it just arrives a month after I use the power, but that doesn't help me. If I wanted to lower the power, it tells me, yeah, this is how you could have lowered it last month. Highlights dollars, not consumption, to your point. And it lumps everything all together as well, so that you may have a hot water heater, you may have a dusk to dawn light, you may have one of those, I think it's a plug-in piece now that goes behind the meter there, that's subscription-based as well, and perhaps there are other things as well, but they're all lumped in together with the actual energy consumption. Let's move on to the other side. And what are some good features of a bill like this? From the perspective, again, of energy literacy. The graph pointing out month over month, the black line is current year, the gray line is previous year, so this person is, for whatever reason, has lowered their energy consumption through all of these months, the winter months. It's a good thing. Maybe they put in heat pumps, right? Something like that. So this is good, maybe not as prominent as it could be if we wanted the eyeballs to come straight to that. And here's the other one that I can say, as a data geek, I like. It's this one right here. And it's the date comparison between this month and last month and the same month the year previous, billing days and the electricity in kilowatt hours. The only downer from my perspective, through my lens, would be I would prefer if it was a daily as opposed to the billing period, because the billing period can vary from 29 days to 33 here. That's a pretty significant difference, right? 4 days over that time period, that's quite a significant difference. But you see, if we had that, maybe that would help us understand relatively how we're doing, and if perhaps it was a little bit more prominent. Okay, so let's move on then to the furtherance of energy literacy. Perhaps we do a bit better if we had a way of knowing our consumption in real time. And now there are lovely tools that are out there. Now, is anyone familiar with this one? Okay, this is actually Blue Line Innovations. It's a company in Newfoundland. I don't think they're manufacturing those tools in Newfoundland, but it's a system whereby you can, and maybe it's only software. No, I think there's a hardware piece. No, maybe the software speaks to the meters. Now, I'm not sure exactly how it works, but the sense of it, the basics of it is that you can buy this system and you can get real time. And then it uses a bit of machine learning, I believe, to figure out what loads are what. And then you can start to realize from the dashboards, either on your phone or on your computer, what is using things. So if, for example, it learns fairly quickly if there's something that's coming on every half hour, that's probably your fridge or your freezer or something like that. So it starts to compartmentalize that out. And anyways, if you're a data geek, or if you just like to save energy, this is kind of a good starting point. Here's a system that's for homeowners. Here's another one too that I'm hearing good things about. I have no personal experience with either of these, but Emporia, and it's a bit of hardware that mounts down in your main box and actually notches onto your main circuits, and it can separate things out by circuit. Apparently, I hear good things from people who are way wiser than I am, who live in this space. Shift Energy, right here in St. John. Interesting, right? It's a Mariner company, and they do energy-saving dashboards and platforms for large commercial buildings. I think their coup is one of the hockey rinks down in Florida that they do the energy management on, and using their software systems, they've saved them $1 zillion of energy down there. They say, we use machine learning to deliver which tells me that they're probably getting a deep dive into consumption trends, and maybe they can give all kinds of directions and advice that involve no hardware or money spending installations, which would be really cool. You know, if you can save a ton of money without having to install a single thing, not too bad, right? So, well, here we go. Smart meters already mentioned, and as they come, then hopefully the next step, which will be a nice marriage with better energy literacy, would be time of day rates. You know, a lot of places outside Canada already have them. Like across the States, there's tons of time of day rates from what I know. This happens to be the chart for Ontario. And it's kind of neat because they flip between their summer and their winter. In the winter, they have a peak times here. This is winter, yeah. Peak times at breakfast and supper, like us. But in the summer, air conditioning is a bigger deal in Southern Ontario. So all of a sudden, their peak times switch, and they go, what, it's around April to November, something like that. Yeah, there we go, November 1st, April 30th. But you see the rates pretty significant. So that if you have an awareness of those and you know what's consuming energy at home and you have the ability to shift loads, you have a massive opportunity to save a ton of money, but also you're doing a good thing for the environment and for the grid because it can defer the need for building new capacity or for starting up the stinky plants. Right? It's kind of cool, it's kind of neat. I hope, and of course that's all enabled by smart meters. So fingers crossed, but I'd be a big fan of the very next thing, as soon as the smart meters are all installed, NB Power going forward and saying time of day rates with a nice aggressive price difference that will be a sufficient incentive. Because I think there's also been some experience in Ontario that initially that price differential wasn't enough to persuade enough people to load shift. But maybe this one is. Take a look at this. This just came out, I think, a few months ago. They call this the ultra low. But look at this. If you could get a kilowatt hour for 2.8 cents, I mean, that's crazy, right? And if you have the self-discipline and energy literacy and enough controls that you can keep yourself out of this 5 hours from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. Whew. Potential for a lot of savings there, right? And again, it's a win-win-win all around for the grid, the environment, for the consumer potentially. So, well, what kind of things do we have control over? This is a washer at home. Anyways, there's this button here, delay wash. You press that and you press it once, delays the wash 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. As long as it's in a quiet place, it's not going to wake the household up. You can do your laundry overnight when power potentially would be 2.8 cents in that rate. Any guesses how many watts a clothes dryer takes? If we were to plug it in the meter, it doesn't fit the meter, right? Because the cord is a 220 cord. Any guesses? 4,500 watts. At least whenever I went online to look, and I'm sure there's a range of them, but they are energy hogs when they're running, right? They are energy hogs. So if we could switch those loads to overnight, whew, seems there's a win-win there. Here's another big one, I think. And this has got the beautiful potential. This is our Bolt. You know, I have a solar system at home with a small battery backup in the basement. It's only 2 kilowatt hours. This thing has got a 65 kilowatt hour battery in it. I mean, it's enormous, right? And the nice thing with this one is you don't need any fancy charger on the wall. There's a dashboard display that lets you program when the thing charges. Point being, a lot of EVs have this control. If all of a sudden you could fill up your car for 2.8 cents overnight, when do you think you'd fill her up? You know, do that comparison with gas. Gas prices don't go down to a quarter of the price overnight. So all of a sudden, in a future with more EVs, without any special modification, all of a sudden we have the capacity to shift a significant part of a load into that off-peak time. And here's maybe potential of the future. And for me, I can tell you, I find this very exciting. I know there are pilots going on already in some jurisdictions whereby a utility essentially borrows the battery of the vehicle and uses that vehicle energy into the grid at peak times and then refills it when there's plenty of power on the grid. I remember hearing about a pilot in Denmark that was that way, and they rewarded every EV owner a significant amount of money for the cycling of their battery. But talk about potential, because I mentioned my car has 65 kilowatt hours in the battery. This thing I think is about 125, 130 kilowatt hours. That's significant. They advertise that you can run your house in a power failure, but the bigger potential, it seems to me, is where you can start to feed the grid. And if you have a fleet of these, all of a sudden you can start to make a bit of a dent into that, right? But it all comes down to energy literacy again, too, it seems to me. Well, there we go with energy literacy, but I hope that helped illustrate how far we could go. So let's move on then to community-based social marketing. First of all, what the heck is it? Social marketing is a little bit more, as the title of that book would suggest, an approach to develop activities aimed at changing or maintaining behaviors. Because you see an awful lot of the solutions to climate, energy management, grid management, it's change behaviors, right? But how do we do that? People are like rivers. We follow the path of least resistance, right? But there are some principles of social marketing that might be relevant in all of our worlds in terms of if we're trying to change behavior somehow. And I remember I first discovered this a number of years ago when I worked at Efficiency New Brunswick. Because here we were trying to develop efficiency programs around the province, but if you're trying to change people's behaviors and make them take advantage of programs and reduce energy consumption, you better know a little bit about how we work. And that's essentially what this is. This was written by Doug Mackenzie Moore, this book, who used to be a prof at STU up in Fredericton. He's now out in BC, I think, running a consultancy out there. But the short of it, it's a good little read and not a big book. So it's a good little read. It is worthwhile if you're in that space. But I'll boil it down to, for me, the 3 key takeaways from this book in terms of changing behaviors. There they are: barrier analysis removal, prompts, and communication and feedback. A little bit more on each of these. The first one, barrier analysis and removal. Everybody here knows which way we should be going to work, right? In a perfectly efficient, sustainable world, right? But how many of us do it? So why don't we do it? Why do most people, and it's not, I don't mean to pick on this group, it's all of us, right? Transit systems all over Canada, except in the monstrous, in the really metropolises, a lot of places transit systems are just working to keep the system going because of low ridership. And in the meantime, people do sit in traffic for quite a while. So why do we do this? What are some of the barriers that might prevent us from taking the bus? A whole bunch of factors. They are real and legitimate barriers, right? We've got to stop for groceries on the way home or that type of thing. So the trick then would be, and you can know for sure, St. John Transit is big into this, how do you remove the barriers so that more people would choose to do this? You know, some people don't like standing out in the cold, well, then you get nice bus shelters, that kind of thing. Or in some areas they put Wi-Fi on their vehicles so that all of a sudden it's not dead time. It's useful time. You're not sitting in traffic waiting for the person ahead of you. You can actually be sitting, catching up on your morning email or doing whatever you like to do. Other things, here's the Comex that runs up the valley. And it was actually started by, I believe, the St. John Parking Commission, not even St. John Transit. Why? Because it was too hard to find parking downtown. It was too expensive to build new parking spaces. It would be way better for the Parking Commission if we get more people to leave their cars out of town, come in. Then we don't have to build new parking spaces. So here's the Comex, and it stops at, what, 2 or 3 places up and down the valley. It runs very much on a to-the-minute schedule, and it drops people off at King Square, I believe. And it works for the cluster of people who happen to be up the valley and work right downtown. And I think there are even some carpool parking lots at the stops. So talk about barrier analysis and removal, and quite affordable, because the higher gas prices go, the more this makes financial sense as well. I have family in Holland, so I've been a number of times, and I find it fascinating how they favor bicycles, and they have really great public transit systems even out in the countryside. And in the transit world, there's this thing called the last mile problem, which is essentially when you get towards the end of the run, the density of the homes and the people is really quite thin, and so it becomes really difficult to run a functional bus service in that kind of a scenario. So, well, here in Holland, put a bike rack next to the bus stand so people can bike that kilometer, come to the bus stop, be under the shelter, and catch the bus when it comes by, right? Barrier analysis and removal. If it's not safe on the roads, well, maybe you adjust the roads. That's a typical rural street in Holland too. The cars have to move out of the way when they meet. And it's the same in Copenhagen in Denmark. Denmark actually has more bike use, I think, even than Amsterdam. We always hear about Amsterdam, and they favor the traffic signals. Montreal is going a long way that way now too. But you see, if all of a sudden you make the right thing to do, the easiest thing to do, more people will do it. Safety reasons and other reasons. This is a photo I took at King's Place in Fredericton. I like to take stairs. Sometimes I sit on my butt way too long, so I think the stairs is at least something I can do to try to do a little physical activity. But try to find the stairs in King's Place. And when you find them, This is what they look like. I've never been in a federal penitentiary, but I have to think it looks and sounds a bit like this because it's metal and stone and it's not a hospitable, friendly place at all to go to the stairs. Elevators are right in the center for everybody to take. The stairs are hidden way around back. Imagine if you reverse that. If your goal was, let's say, better health and to try to encourage people to be fit and to take the stairs. So barrier analysis and removal, the first one, pretty big deal. Second one is prompts, and that's just simple little reminders at the point of usage. And because we're busy, we forget. We're human. I remember I saw this at a museum down in the Boston area. Good place to put it, right? Where we're going to be using the paper towels. If anyone is interested, I put this thing together, and I have a few samples here if you'd like to take a couple later on. Same idea. You know, you can put them in washrooms. You can put them next to photocopiers if you wanted to, whatever. But a simple reminder right at the point of usage. That's a prompt. Here's another one. You say, oh, isn't that old school? Still works. Reminder at a light switch. Please turn it off if you're the last one to leave the room. Some cases like this one, we've allowed automation to do this for us because it seems that maybe we assume people will never do that. Just let the technology do it. This can still work. In fact, it's probably better if we can engage people versus relying on technology. Right? A number of years ago, I spoke at a major construction company down in Halifax, and a friend of mine drives a backhoe for that company. He called me up the next day. He said, gee, my boss showed up, and he turned off his pickup truck for the first time ever when he arrived on the work site. I took that as a compliment. He said, the next thing, everybody got these. Your keys to start your vehicle or to leave it idling. Not too bad, right? It's a little prompt, just a little reminder right at the point of sale. And then here's number 3, it's communication and feedback. This is a picture I took. It was actually on the ferry boat to Newfoundland. What do you think is in that blue bin? Pretty much everything is there. Now, if you analyze that, you might find that most of that stuff is indeed recyclable in one program or other, but people on the ferry come from all kinds of states and provinces, so when you don't have clear communication, this is what happens. I'm fairly sure the folks on the boat didn't separate that out. So I think I know where that stuff ended up in spite of the good intentions, the blue box and all that kind of stuff. I think so. That's at UNB, in the sub at UNB. Not bad, it seems to me, right? Because it's hard to go wrong there. And maybe there should be a sign across the top that says, if you don't know where it goes, please put it in the trash so you don't mess everything else up. You know, there might be some people who just don't bother. So, well, then at least put it in the trash and don't mess everything else up, right? But I know it works because a number of years ago at my son's school, they feed about 400 people each year at the spring picnic and generally would generate a lot of trash. So one year the kids got together, decided to really put a focus on recycling, called it the One Bag Challenge. Can we feed 400 people and produce less than one bag of trash? So here was the setup. Kids made all of their nice art. Only one disposal center with somebody standing by with a bit of advice. We knew all the waste streams that were coming. And at the end of the day, 400 people with full tummies and half a bag of trash for the whole thing. Right? Clear communication and prompts. And, well, you see speed limit signs, and they kind of work if there's a police officer around. But I bet these work a bit better for any of us, right? Because they flash at you, and everybody else sees it right away if you're speeding. Right? So, new vehicles these days a lot of times have real-time feedback on the dash. Nice, because it's proven, apparently. I think Nissan came out with that, and they had some research that suggested you could save 10% on fuel if drivers all had an awareness of how they drive and in terms of having real-time feedback in terms of how they drive. Pretty amazing stuff. You know, even if you don't buy into the whole sustainability piece, I think there's another reason for us to want to think about sustainability and producing more of our energy here sustainably. If you can get energy from the sun or the wind by investing in the machine that harvests that energy and the fuel is free in perpetuity, I don't know about you, but that's, to me, my Dutch instincts and roots. That's pretty compelling, you know, free fuel. So, a number of years ago, I stumbled upon a website called the Global Footprint Network. I'd encourage anyone to go and check it out too. Basically, the promise of the Global Footprint Network was this, that Carl, if you want to input some basic elements of your lifestyle, we'll tell you how much land it takes to sustain, Carl. But I entered all this information anyways, and I hit enter with confidence and maybe even a little bit of cockiness until it came back and told me that if everybody lived like me, we'd need 4 planets. There are no 4 planets, it's only 1. I come to find out afterwards that the Canadian footprint is 4 planets. If everyone lived like us, we'd need 4 planets. And you say, well, that's impossible. But we are actually living now, if you go further on the website, they go into the whole area of global overshoot. And humanity is consuming more than the planet produces each year. You say, well, how can that work? Well, you can cut more trees than the forest regrows for a while, but eventually you get the clear cut. And you can catch more fish than the ocean produces for a while until there are no more fish left. That would be overshoot. I tell you, this set me on a journey that continues today. It was an epiphanal moment, honestly. When I did that website, all of a sudden the light bulb came on. It hit me like a brick wall. Set me on a journey to consume less, to strive to live more lightly on the planet in every area of my life. It's a journey that continues to today. Not down to 1 planet yet. I can tell you, it's really hard as a Canadian to get down to 1 planet, but definitely making progress. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested, take a peek. I think I have the other one up here as well. Here's another good one too. This one's European-based, I think. Both of them give you a report. So it's not just telling you how badly you're doing, which is a real downer. But they both give you a report that helps you see what comprises those 4 planets. So you know the big areas that you might wish to tackle. For me, flying. I don't even do that much flying anymore, but now I do less. Because it was the one that was taking things up for me. And Climate Hero, this one will also ask you to make a commitment. How much do you think you could reduce this? And then they'll send you a follow-up email if you're up for it a couple of months later to see, hey, how are you doing with that? So interesting, right? To some extent, it's energy literacy, except it's larger sustainability literacy, perhaps. Some people say, oh, this climate change business, we'll just adapt, right? I struggle with that because we haven't stopped the source of climate change yet. So how can we adapt when we're still fueling the change that is happening? Once we've stopped fueling that, then we'll adapt to what that reality turns out to be, I suppose. But to start just adapting now without stopping the source of the problem, it seems to me, I don't see how that can work. And I've struggled with how do you explain that? And I found this quote which I think does it pretty good. If your home was flooding because you'd left the faucet on, your first step wouldn't be to start mopping. You'd first cut off the flooding at its source, the faucet. Rings true for all of us, right? And maybe that works when it comes to solving climate change too. We're already in a situation where we do have to adapt a bit, unfortunately, because we've already got change upon us. But mitigation is obviously the critical thing. We've got to turn the tap off somehow. I speak in a good number of schools, and I find the places, and businesses as well too, or conferences, that sort of thing, but I find in schools in particular, where the best things are happening, it's because there's a champion on staff. I put that up there because maybe you find in your places of work too, there's room for champions. People who might say, you know what, I think we can do better, and I think I'm going to be the proponent who gets this thing going. Success often starts with champions. Einstein said we can't solve our problems using the same kind of thinking we used when we first created them. My own interpretation of that would be maybe that means we need to rethink everything we hold to be true. That's pretty big and sweeping, right? But I got to tell you, I've been forced to re-examine so many of my paradigms since I've started doing sustainability work and since the threat of climate change became so apparent to me. So many paradigms. And maybe we need to rethink a bunch of them. You know, I was raised on a dairy farm, and now you start to realize, ooh, animal agriculture has an enormous footprint. Veggie-based diets are way better for the planet. Some would argue better for us as well, too. Talk about a paradigm shift when you were raised on a dairy farm. Good heavens. It's difficult. I get that. But maybe the moment requires the best of us in this one. You know, we've lived in a world where we see ourselves as the center. Maybe we need to come to grips with the notion that we're just part of that bigger web. We're part of that bigger net. And it doesn't depend on us so much as we depend on it and everyone else, all of our cohabitants here. I spend a lot of time in this space, you know, and to me it kind of all boils down to solutions, boil down to a couple of things. One of them is, it seems to me, we need to start making pretty much all of our big decisions through the lens of sustainability. Not necessarily economics, certainly not convenience, and some of these other things that we might first be inclined to. Sustainability. What's the long-term impact of this? First Nations had the rule about 7 generations, remember? Maybe you've heard about that. I remember when I first heard about that. Amazing, right? 7 generations. Maybe we need to start thinking about that because we sure drifted away from that. The other thing is, every time when I'm reading about solutions, community comes up, working together. And it seems to me we need to work together like never before. We're all in this deal together. It's all of us. And it seems to me if we're going to go forward, we need to do it together, helping each other. That's going to challenge a few paradigms as well when it comes to things like tech transfer and helping out people who can afford things a bit less perhaps than we can. Seems to me those are the solutions, you know. This is the last slide before we'll pause. And I wanted to share this with you. It'd be about 5 years ago. I was at home listening to the radio, and this lady came on the radio, and she just was bubbly about her electric vehicle and the solar array that she had powering the electric vehicle. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. I want that. But it seems so far away, so impossible, so expensive, so complicated. Fast forward 5 years to today. This is home. There's the EV and there's the array, and there's another one up on the garage roof as well. As soon as I have a year's data, I can tell you whether we made it to net zero. Now I put that up there, I don't mean at all to be boastful, because honestly, trust me on this, I'm not a tech person at all. I put that up there because I just would like to impart that if I can do that, sure, I think anybody can do it. You know, it's there now, it exists. That's one reason I put it up. The second reason is this. If 5 years ago that seemed so impossible, change is also exponential. So imagine where we will go with the next 5 years. Imagine the potential. Imagine the possibilities. I sure hope through this presentation I've inspired you a bit, hopefully opened your minds a little bit to some things that may have been new, hopefully helped out on, well, all three of those elements. Okay, well, let's leave it at that. One last slide is some of the best guidance I ever got in my life. This came from my mother years ago when I left home for university. I was full of it, right? I was going to go and change the world, like we all do when we're leaving home for university. And my mother, in her wisdom, said, well, maybe you won't succeed in changing the whole world, but at least you can change your little corner of it. Stuck with me, right here. Still is right here. Mom's 99 now. But it's still great advice. I put that out there too. You know, my heroes are Terry Fox, lead by example. Greta Thunberg now, step forward, and holy Moses, she's a kid changing the world. Gandhi said, be the change you seek in the world. They're my heroes. They can do it, why not me? I'll challenge you, why not any of us? I hope through this information today I've helped empower you in your spaces to make positive difference for your workplaces, for our energy systems, also for our environment.